Hi everyone, I'm Vatsidi Sivangsai. I am the director at MEJA, the Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance. And we want to start off with appreciating you all and being here on this awesome spring evening. I know many of you have so much to do in the community and with your families and neighbors and friends, and we appreciate that you're here to get the latest updates on the budget, which just passed yesterday. Um, for us, we're thrilled to also be joined by our awesome colleague at MassBudget, Colin Jones. He'll get a chance to introduce himself, but we'll also share a little bit about MEJA, the Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance. We're a statewide coalition of organizations led by parents, students, and community members and union folks from across the state. And we work together to ensure that we protect and improve public education for all students from kindergarten all the way through college. And tonight's discussion will hopefully provide folks here and folks who will be listening and looking at the recording later, the information needed to move some of the policies and decision making to align with our values. As you know, the budget is a complex process that's a lot of times difficult to understand, and a lot of numbers that many of us would take a lot, maybe a few months or maybe a year or two. I don't know, Colin, how long it took you to figure out these numbers, but definitely a longer time than our mass budget friends who would be sharing this information with us. So with that, we hope that this information tonight will start and build upon the work that you are doing with your local communities and your organizations. I also want to give a huge shout out to our coalition partners, Citizens for Public Schools, AFT, Massachusetts and National, and also BEJA, the Boston Education Justice Alliance, our table in Revere Education Justice Alliance, our Lowell Education Justice Alliance, and our folks in Lawrence. We also want to give a special shout out to Worcester folks too. We have the Worcester Education Justice Alliance, and we also have our other partners from Progressive Mass and Quest and many other organizations that are joining today. And together we continue the fight for our public schools and continue the fight for our students and educators and school staff. So thank you again, and I'll go ahead and pass this over to Colin so we can get started and we can have a conversation after this. Now, Colin, just want to do a quick note that we might have some parents or community folks who will be joining that may need to switch to Spanish translation, so that maybe Jen or I or Gabriella may stop you and just pause in order to help them to get set up.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Yes, I brought fewer slides than usual in the hopes that I would be able to go slower and support the interpretation. So we're on the same page there. So yes, thanks to MEJA, thanks to all the partner groups involved, thanks to our Gabriella, our wonderful translator. So my name is Colin Jones. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for Education at MassBudget, the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank and research organization that works across the budget, across a bunch of policy areas to help create a great state for everyone. So I will, in a moment, I'll start sharing my slides, but we're going to talk about some basics of the budget process, just to, wherever you're coming in, hopefully we'll just sort of talk about the basics of the budget, where we are, and then more specifically, what are some of the hot topics for this year, and especially in the education budget. But it's really all connected. Obviously, education funding is a part of the overall budget. So let me switch to slides real quick. Okay. All right. So, so to start on just the basics of what is the budget. So it's a set of inflows and outflows of funding, and what's coming in is tax collections. It's income taxes, sales taxes. It's like you go to the DMV, you pay a license fee. There's fees. You get a fishing license or something like that. You're paying fees. There's revenue from gaming and things like that. So there's all these different types of state revenue, and there's also a large chunk of our state budget comes from federal funding. There's a lot of stuff in healthcare, transportation, a number of other things. And then all of those inputs create the state budget, and then it goes out across the state to our schools, our campuses, public housing, parks, the justice system, transportation and roads. So that's what the state budget is. It's one way to think about it. But as we sort of talked about at the top, even as an analyst who's looking at spreadsheets all the time, I always want to try to start with, this budget is our values, right? It's a set of choices about what kind of state we want and what is important enough for us to fund together collectively and what deserves funding. So that element of it, I think we all understand, and it's really important to start with that, even if you're doing we're going through all these huge numbers and spreadsheets. We want to start with what is our values and how do we translate that into the funding that we provide across the board. So I sort of mentioned this before, but there's sort of an inflow outflow of how funding works, and just like pretty much every state has to, unlike the federal government, it has to balance its budget every single year. So the revenue going in has to equal the spending going out. So that's something to keep in mind. We don't have the option of going to deficits or things like that. So, and again, as I mentioned, there's this revenue mix that of the different pots and pots of funding that support the state budget. It's the largest piece, obviously, is about 60% is your income taxes that you see on your paycheck every couple of weeks. You file in April. It's your sales tax when you buy something over the counter. Those taxes are really, there's other ones on different types of income, but those are kind of the biggest chunk of the state budget. And the second largest is about a quarter of the state budget is supported by revenue from the federal government. Within that, there is actually a lot for education, but there's more for things like healthcare, for example. Then there's like fees and things like that I mentioned before. And then which is about 10%. And then there's small pots of money that sometimes get a lot of attention on things like gaming, lottery, like rideshare taxes is a new one. Like so there's these kind of grab bag, but that's really, even though they're like sometimes new and exciting, they're actually a lot smaller than what's your standard taxes and federal support. So the players involved, it's not just numbers, right? So the players and the public officials that are going to be steering this budget process from the State House, it's, of course, we start with our governor, Maura Healey. She is, she has her take on the budget, produces her own budget, and then implements the funding that's given to state agencies which she oversees, like the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, although it's a little more complicated because they have their own board, but they also are appointed by the governor. And then as far as in the legislature, our House Speaker is Rep. Ron Mariano, and his budget chief is Rep. Aaron Michaelwitz. And it's typically considered, the Ways and Means Committee, just a fancy way of saying the Budget Committee, is widely known as kind of the most influential committee because you are steering this, nearly $60 billion bill through the State House every year. So that's clearly known as a very, it's the second most powerful post compared to your leader of the entire branch, like your Speaker or Senate President is the Ways and Means Chair. And so on the Senate side, it's Senate President Karen Spilka. and Ways and Means Chair Michael Rodericks. So they're kind of, some, and not to, every representative, your senator, your representative, they all have a role to play in the budget process. So some of them are on the Ways and Means Committee, some of them are on other committees, and all of them are having discussions with their colleagues in leadership about what are their budget priorities, what does their district need. So everybody in the legislature does have a role to play. So again, a little bit about just the timeline here. This is a special year because it's the first year of a new governor. But typically it would be January would be the first budget from the governor. Because it's the first year of a new governor's term, it was actually in March. But the rest of these dates hold. So we're in at the end of April. The House has just completed its budget. It started in its budget committee, then it went to the full House and was finished a couple days ago, actually. And so then it will go to the Senate Ways and Means Committee, the Budget Committee, and within about 10 days, we'll be seeing a budget plan from the Senate. It will go through amendments in the Senate, and by June, we will have those two branches with a different budget, and they will sort of hash out the differences. It's behind a closed door. There will be 6 members of the legislature, 3 senators and 3 representatives who will hammer out the differences and create a final budget. So this is actually an important time in the sense that, like, if something is on the fence, or it went one way in the governors, or went one way in the House, the Senate can kind of be the tiebreaker. Or if there's something that didn't make it at all into the process, the Senate budget would kind of be the last time that something could be introduced. And so it's not too late, obviously, to have some influence on what's going to happen. After the two sides figure out their differences, the governor has another chance to make some changes. Sometimes that's overridden. And then the fiscal year, so it's like the 2023-2024 fiscal year, or fiscal year 24, will start on July 1st. Ideally with a complete budget in place, although sometimes they get late and have to do an extension. So it doesn't always work perfectly according to Schoolhouse Rock diagrams. So with that kind of background, just on the basics of the budget and the process, I do think it's very important to make sure we cover to bring people along with us. So what's some of the big stories in this budget, and especially for education funding? So, and it has to do really with because voters passed the fair share surtax, which is the additional 4% surtax on incomes over 1 million last year at the ballot, that creates a lot of new opportunities. So we've got $1 billion so far to use, being projected to use in next year's budget. So each one of the branches, the governor, House, and Senate, and then eventually the final budget, will have a specific approach of how they're using these funds. And as it was passed, it's sort of the boundaries around it is limited to education and transportation. So it's going to be in those two areas, but how much will go to each, and how much within education, how do you do that mix? That's going to be a really important story to keep an eye on. So that's really awesome, exciting, all the work that everybody did on the campaign to make our revenue system more progressive and more fair, and to provide revenue to be able to do all the things we need to do. Fantastic victory. Challenging, there's a challenging situation that at this point, the governor, as well as the House and Senate, are also putting forward a tax cut package that includes around 400 million in regressive tax cuts. So it's tax cuts that go mostly to wealthy individuals and families. So at the same time, you're adding $1 billion of new revenue that we've been working for the better part of a decade. At the same time, you're creating regressive tax cuts to equal about 40% of the new revenue. Now, which, that seems self-defeating to what we've all been working towards. And so I want to be fair here and say, look, there are also within that, they have it's not just their tax plan is not just the 400 billion regressive pieces. There are other parts like tax cuts for seniors on fixed income, child tax credit, which is, those of us with kids, I guess I'm biased, I have 2 kids, but, we get child tax credits, which are going generally to working people. But of course, with any type of tax credit or break, that does result in revenue that you don't have to work with. So you have to really make a strong case. This is broadly going to people who need the support, as opposed to the wealthiest families, households, and investors who have been doing extremely well in our economy in the past 3 years. And you're going to have to convince me that they need some huge tax break. So the fair share plan. So each branch has its own fair share plan. And my big thinking when I look at these things is, man, these are great proposals. Why can we not have both, right? Why can't we make better revenue choices and then have both of these as an option? So I'll just list kind of some things in the governor's plan, some things in the House plan, and a couple of things that are in both. So Governor Healy had 140 million for higher ed building to make green buildings, improve buildings on our campuses. It's absolutely needed. There was around 60 million to hold tuition and fees at UMass and state universities, community colleges level. So don't have a tuition increase. That's really important. There's some other student support and diversity inclusion efforts in higher ed as well. Also a great thing to be doing. So none of that was in the House budget. However, in the House column, we have, they were able to sustain a COVID era program that right now, no kid across K-12 in our entire state has to pay for school lunch right now. So the House is putting in 160 million to maintain that, which is a fantastic program for nutrition and just to remove red tape and just feed kids so they're ready to learn. It's a strong, strong program to continue. They had money to do that, but then they didn't do these other things. There's about 100 million they have for building funds, but it's for K-12, which, greening our school buildings and improving them, fantastic. The House also did an expansion of a scholarship program for students who are pursuing things like science and technology, manufacturing, healthcare, childcare, other job fields that are really in high demand in the state. So that's good. Although, of course, why not? You want to also look at other majors too and make sure it's affordable. So, there also is some overlap between the two, where they both have this new kind of small but encouraging program to increase higher ed affordability called Mass Reconnect. And then there's both of the budgets so far have significant funding from Fair Share to expand scholarships. We won't really focus on these issues tonight, but there's also funding for childcare, and then there's, as intended, there's about half of the Fair Share funds are for transportation. It's important. We're not talking about tonight, but it is very, very important. So as we see it, I think, so what are the choices ahead of us? So first, let me say what I don't think the choice is. I don't think the choice is, do we want to do K-12 or do we want to do higher ed? Do we want to do higher ed or do we want to do childcare? Do we want to do childcare? Do we want to do, within the education field? I think it would be a mistake to think that it's a zero-sum thing where the various parts of education and even transit should be arguing amongst ourselves. I don't think that's the choice that's ahead of us. I think we can do all of those things. So in all areas of education, we can have a strong budget. We do both of the great things from each column that I just mentioned, that we have revenue to do all of that. May not have to do everything in the end, but we do a lot of both from both columns. So do we want to do those things? Do we want tuition to stay the same or prevent a hike in tuition, keep kids fed and ready to learn in school, do capital funds, not just for K-12 schools, but also higher ed campuses? Do you want to do wraparound and support services for kids from pre-K through college and other things across the budget? So that's option one. And option two is, would we like to provide a tax break to people who make short sales or who within holding an asset for less than a year and sell stocks and bonds and make sure that that's more profitable for them, where nearly 80% of the benefit of those capital gains cuts are going to the top 1%? And do we want to provide tax breaks for families with estates over 1 million, with particularly focused benefits on estates worth over 3 million? Is that the priority over making sure all our kids in school have free lunch? That's the choice ahead, and it's not really, I think, between all these amazing programs we can do in point one. It's really if we get the revenue policy right and the rest of the budget, we can do a lot of these things and not be in that position. So that's just my take. We'll see what everybody thinks in discussion. So just a little bit for numbers people. This is just a quick snapshot of the K through 12 budget right now in fiscal 23. So just a quick breakdown of this. It's the largest program by far. This blue bar is the K through 12 formula funding called Chapter 70 for the cities and towns and districts. This is really rising significantly. We added in this current year, we added $650 million to K-12 programs to do the Student Opportunity Act, which is this critical 2019 K-12 funding bill that it's been fantastic so far. So that's something to keep an eye on. That's been significantly growing. The second bar is just teacher pensions. Technically it's in pension spending, but it's for retired teachers to have a secure retirement. So I put that there. It's about 2.3 billion. Like every other program, so the grants, the special ed grants, the circuit breaker grants, the charter school grants, then also like the admin and other programs is in this 1.5 billion orange slice there. And then the Mass School Building Authority is that 1.2 billion as well. So I have to say this, I'm obligated to say this. We live in a world where a single high school in our state has cost, nearly around $400 million. So I always wonder about that MSBA dollar, how far is that going? And as we do the Student Opportunity Act, which is more like the individual funding for students and running schools each year or operating funding, we also need to make sure that every building is safe, is green, is welcoming to students, and that there isn't this division across lines of wealth and communities that are just able to build these world-class schools and others who are not. So that's something we have to always keep an eye on as well, which again makes a case for building funds across K-12 and higher ed as well. So I'll do highlights of the K-12 budget proposals so far. So the fiscal 24 ones, we'll do the same for higher ed, and then I think we'll be pretty much wrapped up. So
Hey, Colin, for this one, can you go a little bit slower?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so far, both proposals are doing year 3 of 6 of the Student Opportunity Act with that new K-12 funding bill. And just like this year, it's about 640 million. So both the governor and the House proposed very significant increases to that, which is fantastic. And those are stacking on top of each other. So last year's increases to Chapter 70 are secure, and then you build on top of that to get us 1 year closer to the Student Opportunity Act plan. So that is fantastic, and we're on pace. And so I know it's not like super exciting to say like a bill we passed 4 years ago is on pace, but we have to stay the course there and be clear on this is why we're doing this. We're doing this to invest in low-income kids, ELL kids, and particularly the districts who serve them. So low-income, urban, diverse districts is where that money is primarily going. And so those same communities should be really, at this point, starting to really start to start investing in things that could be transformative as far as wraparound services, mental health support, after-school programs, pre-K programs, things for teens in middle school and high school to connect to the workforce and explore their career interests and all these other things. So this should be, I would hope, a really exciting period for new funding being added, particularly to the communities and districts that have been underfunded for decades. And we should really get excited about what we're doing, but that doesn't just happen, right? Like MEJA tables and organizers and school committees and all these folks around the state have to hold the powers that be accountable to make sure that money is going to what we want, what our kids need. So there's still some things that have happened over the last couple of years that with the COVID impacts on our schools that are still, I think, are still in the mix. So enrollment overall has dropped by about 4% in our districts across the state compared to before the pandemic. It's sort of stabilized now, so that's something to keep an eye on. There was sort of a reshuffling of where kids went to school somewhat during the pandemic. So as we all experienced at the grocery store or many other places, we've had a high inflation period. in the last couple of years. And actually, as it turned out, our our formula is supposed to account for inflation every year, but it's capped at growing by 4.5%. So the overall formula and all the pieces of funding that go to teachers and the elements for low-income kids and ELL kids, those can only grow by 4.5%, even though inflation was higher than that. So that's something to keep an eye on. And it's going to eat away somewhat at the ability of every district to operate. But I would say the middle income districts or smaller districts where they may not be getting a ton of Student Opportunity Act funding, but they're also facing rising costs on a bunch of things. They're kind of in this squeeze that I think we should keep an eye on and not lose sight of. And then, not to be totally negative, one positive story is the House has maintained the free universal school meals, but that's not in the governor's plan, so that remains to be seen if we're going to be able to keep that going. So as far as higher education, a few of the highlights. So the governor was just more aggressive in using the new fair share revenue for higher ed. It was like over 350 million in her budget compared to around 170 in the House budget. So that that makes it so that the governor's budget really is taking us to the next level of higher ed investment, whereas the House budget is more keeping some of the good things we've been doing going, but it's not, I would say it's not as pronounced. So on both sides so far, it's been increased scholarships, increased affordability, and that's been going from the last couple of years has been a focus on increased scholarships. And then the new program is Mass Reconnect, which is effectively a free community college program, but it's limited to tuition costs, which is only a fraction of total cost of community college, and it's limited by age. So good idea, but we have to kind of see the details of that, how it gets rolled out. And there's other things that I mentioned before, high workforce demand, majors are getting scholarships, those kind of things. So in terms of what I'm looking at is, as the House budget was being released like a week ago, UMass announced a tuition increase, which is standard practice. It's just been constant over the last 15, 20 years. You just every single year, like clockwork, you're raising fees on students. So, but that's not inevitable. If there's enough money in the budget, you can stop those increases. Then there's this other question is, will the building programs be shared across K-12 and higher ed? So will higher ed get a piece, which I think it absolutely needs, into capital programs and buildings? It's obviously like building safety, modern buildings, green buildings, just with every campus on our state, will a student walk in and feel like, my community's invested and cares about me learning. That's always the objective. And then, although there is increases in scholarships, can we get to a bigger, larger, more ambitious plan for higher ed affordability, and not just affordability to, campuses that are breaking down or where adjuncts aren't paid properly, and but universal affordable access to high quality, world-class campuses where the buildings and the staff and everybody's well taken care of. That's kind of the dream. So can we do some of these investments towards a bigger plan? So just a quick comparison of the funding levels in higher ed across these budgets. So orange is just, we started this year, the current budget year that we're in right now, we started at 1.6. There was some additions to scholarships and other programs that brought us up by about 200 million. The governor's proposal, which again is more aggressive on using some of that new revenue for higher ed, is sort of building further on that. Whereas the House is it's keeping some of the things we've done, but it's not really necessarily pushing into a new level. So that's something to keep an eye on. So as far as, let me just close quickly with, there is a lot of details here. As Vatsali mentioned, there's a lot going on. So we do have, if you go to massbudget.org, we have a tool called the budget browser that has tracked funding. You can look at big categories like higher ed and K through 12. You can look at individual items that you're interested in. So you have that. We maintain that to make it useful, because as we know, the hundreds of pages of PDFs that come out are not super accessible. So we have these tools to help folks sort through it. So, sign up for our, go to massbudget.org, sign up, check out our tools and research. And we're always open to questions and stuff. So, so thank you all. And that's why I'll have my contact information here. And as always, it's an honor and privilege.
Thank you, Colin. That was really awesome. Thanks for the big overview and diving into some of the details for our K through 12 and higher education. Some things that you noted really was that this is an opportunity to further invest in our communities. Um, and this is a chance for our decision makers to really show how these investments are aligning with their priorities, right? And the priorities of our communities. So when they make the decisions ultimately here in the next few weeks, we'll see whether or not the priorities are for our people and for our community, or is it to further help those who continue to profit. Um, and so, with this information and the discussion that is coming up, I hope that we can work together to push where it needs to be pushed for people, for our people, and to ensure that the future of the Commonwealth is stronger than it is today. So with that, I just want to send our appreciation to you, Colin, and our appreciation to the Mass Budget crew. We'll go ahead and stop the recording and jump into our discussion.